session today for the Eyes Wide Open seminar, webinar series. And today we're going to be hearing from Kayla, Anthony, and Michael from Waterloo on their project Between Life and Death, the Barriers to Calling 911 during an overdose emergency. So I see some attendees that have come to the other webinar, so welcome back, and a few new names are popping up, so we're really pleased that you could join us as well today. So before we go into the webinar, just a couple of things that I want to share with you. We are recording the session today, so just to let you know about that. We'll have some questions and answers at the end of our webinar, so if you can hold any questions to the end of the presentation, that would be great. In addition, you'll see on your right-hand side that there's a question box there, not to be confused with the chat box, but the question box. If you can type in your questions there, we'll be able to see them, and then we'll be able to call on you later in the presentation to ask a question yourself if you have a mic, and if not, we'll be able to read that for you. So I think that's logistics at this point. So at this point, I will hand it over to Kayla, who's a researcher based here in Waterloo, Ontario, as well as Anthony Bischetti and Michael Parkinson, who work with the Waterloo Region Crime Prevention Council here in Waterloo Region as well. So we look forward to their discussion today. So I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. I just want to be sure you can see the screen at the front end. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Yeah, as promised, I'm not Kayla. My name is Michael. I'm coming to you from Waterloo Region, 1 hour west of Toronto. And with me here in the office is Anthony and Kayla. And what I'll do at the front end is just take a few minutes to let you know how we got to this stage of creating what we think is the first Canadian study on the barriers to calling 911 during an overdose emergency. Of course, I'd like to draw your attention to the film that we've just released. It's about 2 weeks old. It's on YouTube. There's the link there. It's called Eyes Wide Open. And just yesterday, we began shooting a second film. And in that film, we'll talk about barriers to calling 911 during an overdose emergency, as well as overdose prevention, including the lock zone. This is the title of the report, and you'll find the report in its entirety on our website at preventingcrime.ca. And the Council really has a long history of getting involved in overdose issues. It began with this report about 4.5 years ago. It's really a baseline report that Jamie Lee Bell and myself hit home. We looked at coroner data, hospital data, and EMS data, and from that, we determined that in Waterloo Region, 2 people will overdose every day. And what we found in that report, it's important for the current report, is that more people show up at the hospital than call 911, leading us to believe that in some overdose emergencies, the victims are dropped at the hospital doors and the bystanders or witnesses leave the scene. This is a second report, also on our website. It's called Saving Lives, scan of overdose prevention programs in the U.S. Since this time, the number of programs in the U.S. has exploded. There's now more than 200, highly evaluated and supported by a number of blue chip organizations. Today in Ontario in particular, we know a few more things than we knew back then. We know that Canada and USA are the leading consumers of opioids in the world, and we know that within Canada, Ontario is #1, and we're talking about prescription opioids primarily. We also know that for people who are using substances like heroin, approximately 95% of those people started with the prescription from their physician before transitioning on to what we often associate with opioid overdose, heroin use. We also know that 5.5 years ago, overdoses were accidental overdoses were the third leading cause of accidental death in Ontario, and that the rate has gone up since then. Falls remain #1 cause of accidental death, motor vehicle collisions #2. And in speaking with the Ontario coroner last week, this is more recent data, The coroner suggests that in 2011, the number of opioid-related overdose deaths were more than 2 times the number of drivers killed in motor vehicle collisions in Ontario. And those are just opioids. So if you add alcohol plus opioids into the mix, the rate increases by another 50%. We also know that those who are dying, our fellow Canadians, include those who are using as prescribed and those who are using illegally. Quickly from the U.S., this is for the Center for Disease Control. There is no comparable organization or data set in Canada, much to many people's chagrin. Here you see that the sales of opioids, and these are prescription opioids, mirror trends in death rates and treatment admissions. And right now in Florida, there's a national summit going on where they're talking about this very issue. The Center for Disease Control calls it the worst drug epidemic in U.S. history, and they're not an organization that's prone to saying such things without a solid evidence base behind them. On this graph here, also from the Center for Disease Control, you can see that death by opioids exceed those of heroin and cocaine combined. All of which is to say, we think that a similar situation is occurring in Canada, given our opioid consumption rate. But the response in Canada has been very different than the U.S. We're very slow to respond. Nonetheless, what we have done, this is from Ontario about a year ago, but mirrored in other places across North America. What the response has typically been to change what we call higher order systems of control, and this is the glaring example. The notion that by banning OxyContin, that it would lead to a decline in death, in addiction, and expenses to the healthcare system and more. And in the aftermath of OxyContin, these were the kind of headlines we saw locally. We saw a rise in heroin use, in fentanyl use. We saw what we think is potentially a rise in overdose fatalities. And across the U.S., you see similar kinds of headlines. Heroin problems where there wasn't a heroin problem before, et cetera, et cetera. So personally, I never cease to be amazed at the basic failure of to understand economics 101, and that is, you know, just by banning one substance doesn't lead to maybe the kind of outcomes that policymakers and lawmakers were hoping to achieve. And down there in the bottom left, you'll see that's the Chief of Police for Peterborough, but his colleague inside Peterborough Police, I think, summed it up best in saying that, you know, what do you do when one grocery store closes in your community? Well, you go to a different grocery store, and sometimes that's heroin, sometimes that's fentanyl, and sometimes it's going to the doctor and you get a different kind of opioid. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kayla and Anthony. They'll take you through the methodology and what we found in what we think is the first Canadian study on barriers to calling 911 during an overdose emergency. Kayla.
Thanks, Michael. So my name is Kayla Follett. I'm a researcher with the Waterloo Region Crime Prevention Council. And here with me today is, of course, Michael Parkinson, our Community Engagement Coordinator, and Anthony Piscitelli, Supervisor of Planning and Research. Felix Munger couldn't actually be with us here today, but we'd like to acknowledge his valuable work on this project. Thanks so much, Felix. So in this presentation, we will briefly describe what an overdose is, and we'll note the common risk characteristics. We'll talk about the literature review, and then we'll share the way in which we did the study or the methodology. We'll describe our results in detail, and Michael will conclude by discussing policy options to reduce the barriers to calling 911 and to ultimately save lives. So an overdose can occur when a person takes more of a substance or combination of substances than their body can handle. It's a potentially fatal loss of nervous system functioning. And substances that can cause overdose can be categorized into 3 types: downers, such as alcohol and opioids; stimulants, such as speed; and hallucinogens such as LSD. So symptoms of an overdose depend on the substances or combination of substances used. And the most notable risk factors for overdose are mixing drugs, prior overdose, a history of injection, a recent period of abstinence such as after prison or treatment, and HIV positive status. Demographically, Indigenous peoples in Canada are more at risk, males are more likely to die, and homelessness and poverty are also associated with higher overdose risk. As Michael mentioned, overdose is a leading cause of accidental death in Canada, and in Ontario, overdose is the third leading cause of accidental death. So just to situate ourselves for a moment, this table describes overdose deaths, emergency room visits, and hospitalizations in the Waterloo region, the Waterloo-Wellington Local Health Integration Network, or LIN, and the province of Ontario. Local health integration networks are basically organizations who are responsible for health system management within their designated boundaries. So the Waterloo-Wellington LIN area covers Kitchener-Waterloo, Guelph, Cambridge, and several rural areas. So in 2007, as you can see, there were 410 overdose deaths in 2007. There were 8,282 emergency room visits in 2010 and 2,700 hospitalizations. And it's important to note that overdoses are difficult to record for a number of reasons. Statistics are generally believed to be underestimations. So we found a lot of overdose research, and specifically with respect to calling 911, mainly from the US, Europe, and Australia, but none in the Canadian context. So studies have concluded that rates of calling 911 are low or delayed, and this is particularly in comparison to other medical emergencies such as heart attacks. Fear of police involvement is by and large the most common barrier to making the call. Surveying people who use substances illicitly is difficult. However, previous studies have shown that people who witness overdoses are at greater overdose risk themselves, mainly because they share similar risk characteristics, and typically the bystander and victim belong to similar social networks. There's a window of opportunity to intervene during an overdose, because death is not usually immediate, and prognosis is positive if medical attention is received quickly. People who use drugs can often identify the signs and symptoms of an overdose, and people are usually with friends or partners at the time of overdosing, and these friends are usually aware of the types of drugs the victim has taken.